"Everything's fine," the captain said. But just 20 seconds later, the plane was in a fatal dive, its instruments showing altitude, even as it raced toward the sea. What caused seasoned pilots to trust data that was leading them to their deaths? It was the evening of June 24th, 1982. Flight BA-009, a British Airways Boeing 747, had just departed from Kuala Lumpur. Its next destination was Perth, before continuing on to Auckland, New Zealand. On board were 263 people, among them families, children, business travelers, people asleep, people reading quietly beneath the warm cabin lights. Everything felt normal. At the controls sat Captain Eric Moody, just 41 years old, yet already one of British Airways' youngest captains. His co-pilot, First Officer Roger Greaves, was 32. The flight engineer, Barry Townley Freeman, monitored the instruments from his station behind them. Together, they were calm, experienced, confident. The aircraft had reached cruising altitude, 37,000 feet over the Indian Ocean, just south of the island of Java. The weather radar was clean, no storms, no turbulence. Dinner was being served in the cabin, and the passengers were relaxed. Then, something began to change. First, a strange haze appeared in the cabin. Light at first, almost unnoticeable. Some passengers thought it was smoke. Others assumed it was mist from the air conditioning. But it thickened quickly, and with it came a strange metallic scent, like burnt matches or sulfur. Outside the cockpit window, thin blue lights began to shimmer and dance along the leading edge of the wings and across the glass. It was eerie, almost beautiful. The pilots recognized it immediately. St. Elmo's fire, a rare electrical phenomenon caused when static electricity builds up on sharp points during flight. It is not dangerous in itself, but it is almost always a warning, a sign that the aircraft is flying through highly charged air, the kind associated with thunderstorms, or worse. Captain Moody scanned the radar again. Nothing. No clouds, no lightning, no reason for what they were seeing. And then, without warning, engine number 4 began to surge. The sound in the cabin shifted, just slightly. A vibration, a faint roar. Seconds later, it caught fire. The cockpit filled with alarms. The fire suppression system was activated. The engine was shut down. But then, engine number 2 flamed out. Then engine 1. Then engine 3. One after another. All 4 engines failed. The impossible had happened. The aircraft was gliding. A 747, now silent, falling slowly through the dark. No power, no thrust, no sound except the wind rushing past the fuselage and the soft breathing of passengers who had not yet understood just how close they were to dying. They were 37,000 feet in the air, over the ocean, at night. The nearest land was still over 100 miles away, and there was no one who could help them. Not yet. The cockpit had fallen quiet. Not the kind of quiet that follows routine. Not the stillness of cruise flight or the calm that comes with control. This silence was absolute. It wrapped around the crew like a cold, invisible curtain. The kind of silence that does not wait to be broken because it carries with it only one message, that something vital is gone. All 4 engines stopped. Captain Moody stared ahead. There were no flames now, no alarms. Only the slow, inevitable loss of altitude and the steady descent into darkness. The hum of the pressurized cabin had vanished. The comforting vibration of turbine engines that every pilot learns to feel, even without hearing. It was no longer there. He reached for the microphone. His voice, measured and steady, crackled through the aircraft's intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a small problem. All 4 engines have stopped. We are doing our best to get them going again. I trust you are not in too much distress." That sentence has since become famous. But in that moment, it was the voice of calm, spoken not to comfort, but to focus. Because in the face of total engine loss, panic is fatal. And the one thing Moody could control was the tone he set for everyone else. Inside the passenger cabin, the mood shifted slowly. People looked up. Some stared at the ceiling. Others clutched the arms of their seats. A few whispered prayers. There was no screaming. Not yet. Only the realization that something was wrong, but not yet knowing how wrong. In the cockpit, the crew got to work. There was no checklist for this. No simulator that could prepare a pilot for the complete failure of all engines on a 4-engine aircraft at cruising altitude over open ocean. They switched systems, cross-checked instruments, tried to restart. Nothing. The aircraft began to glide. It's difficult to understand what that means unless you've flown. A Boeing 747 fully loaded does not fall from the sky. It glides, like a wounded bird, wide-winged and reluctant, each minute costing altitude, each mile forward stealing away the sky. At a glide ratio of roughly 15-to-1, the crew knew they had around 20 minutes before they would meet the sea. That gave them a chance. A small one. Captain Moody turned the aircraft south toward Jakarta. It was still distant, but it was land. It was hope. As they descended through 29,000 feet, the cockpit began to pressurize abnormally. Cabin masks dropped. Oxygen flowed. One of the masks, meant for First Officer Greaves, failed. The tube had detached from the housing. Without it, he could lose consciousness within minutes. There was a choice to make. Descend further, to where the air was breathable, and risk burning precious altitude needed to restart the engines, or hold altitude and risk losing a key member of the crew. They chose to descend, not because it was easier, but because every life mattered, and every decision made in that cockpit would be one they would have to live with. If they survived, the cabin shuddered softly. They leveled at 13,000 feet, still descending, but slower now. There was no noise but the creak of the airframe, the whisper of wind, and the silent prayer that something, anything, would change. Then it did. Without warning, engine number 4 began to spin. Slowly at first, then faster. The needles on the instrument panel began to rise. It restarted. For the first time in 14 minutes, power surged through the aircraft. Then, engine number 3. Then 1. Then 2. In a span of seconds, what had once been a glider was a jet again. Hope returned, not in a cheer, not in celebration, but in the quiet nods between crew members who had faced the void and found the will to keep going. They were still far from safe, but for the first time, survival was no longer a question of if. It became a question of how. The engines were back, but the fear remained. Captain Moody adjusted the throttle slowly, listening for any sign of irregularity. The rumble beneath the floor returned, faint at first, then steady. It was the sound every pilot knows by heart, and in that moment, it carried a weight far greater than power. It was the sound of life, borrowed, not earned, and fragile. The Boeing 747 began to climb, not quickly, but with quiet persistence. The crew exchanged glances. No words, just eyes, acknowledging what had just happened. No one said we're safe. No one could. Because just as they reached a safer altitude, the glow returned. That same electric shimmer stretching across the windscreen. St. Elmo's fire, again. It flickered along the glass, tracing slow lines of light, eerie, silent, too familiar. Moody watched it for a moment, his jaw tight. It was not just a warning now, it was a reminder. They were still in it. Not a thunderstorm, not ice, but something invisible, something dry, something fine. The crew suspected it before. Now they were certain. Volcanic ash. But certainty was no comfort. The aircraft had flown blind into an ash cloud that no radar could see. A cloud with no moisture, no signature. Just glass and stone, floating silently in the atmosphere, shredding everything it touched. And now, Engine 2 began to shake. It was not subtle. It rattled the control column. Vibrations spread through the floor. The crew knew what was coming. If they didn't shut it down, the engine might tear itself loose, damage the wing, compromise the aircraft beyond recovery. They killed the engine. 3 remained. Enough, but just barely. Outside the windows there was little to see. The windshield, once clear, was now frosted with ash. It had scoured the surface like sand, grinding away visibility. There were only small patches left where the glass was still transparent, barely the size of a hand. Jakarta lay ahead. They contacted air traffic control, requesting immediate vectors to land, but the response brought new weight. The instrument landing system, the ILS, was offline. There would be no radio-guided approach, no glide slope, no localizer, only a distance measuring system and altitude calls. It would have to be done by hand in near darkness, with 3 engines, through scratched glass. The descent began slowly. Every foot lost brought them closer to land, but also closer to uncertainty. The terrain beneath was mountainous. They needed altitude to remain safe, but not too much. Fuel was now a concern. Every minute in the air was a calculation between lift, distance, and risk. Moody leaned forward, searching the glass for any sign of light. Then, through one of the few clear spots on the windshield, he saw it. A faint glow, runway lights. They were distant, distorted, but real. His hands were steady, his voice quiet. They began the final approach. Inside the cabin, passengers braced. Some whispered, some stared ahead. Others simply closed their eyes. There was nothing more to say. Every sound, the flaps extending, the gear lowering, the pitch of the engines adjusting, felt amplified, like the world had shrunk to the size of the cockpit, and nothing outside it could be trusted. The approach path was shallow, deliberate. There was no margin for error. 1 degree too low, and they would hit terrain. 1 too high, and they would overrun. Then, contact. The wheels struck the runway with a heavy thud. Not smooth, not perfect, but they were down. Reverse thrust engaged. Brakes held. The aircraft slowed. When it came to a full stop, the silence returned. But this time, it was welcome. They had made it. Not by luck, not by miracle, but by judgment, by discipline, by refusing to give in. And still, no one cheered. Not yet. The aircraft sat still at the end of the runway. Its engines, once roaring with strain, had now been silenced. The heat rising off the tarmac shimmered faintly in the humid night air. For a few seconds, no one moved. Not the passengers, not the crew. As if the plane itself needed a moment to understand what had just happened. Inside the cabin, the air was thick. Not just with the lingering scent of ash and fuel, but with something harder to name. The kind of silence that comes after fear has passed, but before relief has arrived. A hollow stillness. People remained in their seats, motionless, as if uncertain whether the danger had truly ended. Some stared at the seat in front of them, eyes unfocused. Others reached quietly for a hand, any hand, just to feel they were still here. Captain Moody sat quietly in the cockpit. His hands were still resting on the controls, though the plane no longer responded. In front of him, the windshield bore the marks of what they had passed through, scratched, opaque, dulled by the glass dust that had once been air. He looked through the one remaining strip of clarity, the same window through which he had seen the runway appear, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. No celebration, no fist raised in triumph. Just breathe, just stillness. Eventually, the doors opened. Cool air rushed in. Ground staff began to move toward the aircraft, cautious, uncertain. They had expected a different scene, debris, perhaps, or fire. What they found was a plane still intact, weathered, streaked with ash, but whole. its wings extended like arms outstretched after a long fall, never quite believing they had landed. Passengers began to disembark. Some walked in silence. Some cried. A few glanced back at the aircraft, unable to turn away. One man stopped, took out a piece of folded paper from his coat pocket, then slipped it back without opening it. Whatever it was, he no longer needed to read it. There were no injuries. No one was lost. But something had changed. The investigation began within hours. The flight data recorder, the cockpit voice recorder, fuel samples, all taken. The exterior of the aircraft told its own story. Paint stripped away at the leading edges, pit marks along the nose and engine inlets. The windshield, sand-blasted and clouded, no longer serviceable. But the most telling evidence came not from the plane, but from the air it had flown through. Roughly 150 kilometers southeast of their flight path, the volcano Mount Galunggung had erupted. A steady plume of ash, dry and invisible to conventional weather radar, had drifted into the upper atmosphere. It carried with it microscopic shards of volcanic glass and pulverized stone, weightless enough to float undetected, yet destructive enough to bring a jetliner to silence. It wasn't the first time Galunggung had erupted, but it was the first time a commercial aircraft had flown through its shadow without warning. The engines had failed, not because of mechanical fault, but because of what the ash had done. The high temperatures inside each turbine melted the ash into a molten glaze, which then solidified on the engine's internal parts. The engines choked, suffocated. Only when the plane descended into colder, denser air did the hardened glass crack and break loose, just enough to allow airflow to return. Just enough to restart. It was luck, and it wasn't, because the crew had not waited for luck. They had acted, calculated, fought for every foot of altitude, every degree of temperature, every second of time. The aftermath brought changes. Volcanic ash advisories were introduced. Satellite monitoring was expanded. Flight crews across the world were taught to recognize what had once seemed unthinkable, that the sky itself could be hiding something deadly, invisible, and silent. And for those who had been aboard Flight BIA 009, the memory remained. Years later, some of them would meet again, on anniversaries, in interviews, in quiet corners of life where their paths crossed once more. A woman who had sat near the middle of the cabin wrote a book. She called it All Four Engines Have Failed. In it, she described not just the fear, but the stillness that followed. The long pause between descent and survival, the silence that had carried more weight than any sound. And in that silence, something human had endured. Not because of faith, not because of fate, but because when the sky closed in around them, when every system failed and every plan fell away, there were still hands on the controls, eyes on the glass, a voice in the cockpit, calm and unwavering. And through that voice, through that resolve, 263 lives came back from the edge, not by miracle, but by choice.